He looked into the judge's eyes and said, "You're my mom." The entire courtroom is left in shock. Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories. In the hushed, sterile environment of Courtroom 307, Elijah Marshall sat motionless in the front row, his small, trembling hands tightly clutching a photograph. His eyes were focused on the floor, as though the weight of his existence could be hidden by simply avoiding the gaze of those around him. At just 8 years old, Elijah had learned long ago how to make himself invisible. 7 foster homes in 8 years had taught him to stay silent, to bury his memories deep and let no one get too close. But today, in this cold room filled with strangers, he could not escape the tight grip of his past. The photograph, well worn and creased from being carried for so long, was the only thing that kept him anchored. It was the one piece of his history, a history that no one seemed to care about. It was the only evidence of a mother he could barely remember. Judge Rebecca Williams, known for her composed demeanor and unwavering professionalism, glanced up from the case file. Her eyes, sharp as they were, caught sight of Elijah sitting alone in the midst of the sea of adults, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair. Despite the seemingly mundane petition in front of her, another foster home gone wrong, Rebecca couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in her chest. There was something about this case, something about Elijah, that made her stomach twist. As she read through his file, her gaze lingered on the details, the behavioral issues, the series of failed placements, and the vague, incomplete records of his early life. But it wasn't the paperwork that unsettled her, it was Elijah himself. He was so still, so quiet, that it seemed as if he were holding the world at bay with his silence. The Turners, his foster parents, were sitting confidently beside their lawyer, their voices smoothly explaining their reasons for wanting to give up Elijah. Patricia Turner's voice cut through the stillness, describing her frustrations with Elijah's behavior, how he refused to speak, how he wouldn't engage in family activities, how he seemed to stare through people with a vacant, unsettling gaze. The words were clinical, detached, and Rebecca could feel the familiar heat of anger bubbling up inside her. How could they dismiss a child so easily? How could they reduce a broken, silent child to a list of undesirable traits, as if he were an appliance malfunctioning? The more she heard, the more she wanted to scream at them, but she held it in, reminding herself to stay objective. Yet, as she glanced at Elijah, something inexplicable struck her, a gut feeling, a flicker of recognition in his eyes that she couldn't shake. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment, everything else in the room blurred out of focus. His eyes, those dark, wide eyes, felt so familiar. Rebecca had seen countless children pass through her courtroom, but none of them had ever affected her like this. The connection was almost too much to bear. She forced herself to return to the case at hand, her fingers nervously tapping against the desk. But her mind couldn't focus. The image of Elijah's face haunted her. Where had she seen those eyes before? Why did they remind her so much of someone she had lost long ago? Her heart hammered in her chest as the court session continued. But in that moment, a wave of doubt began to flood over her. Something about Elijah's presence, his quiet strength, pulled at something deep inside her. Something she had buried long ago. Could it be possible? Could this child, lost in the system, be the missing piece of her past? The photograph he clutched so tightly, what did it hold? And why? Just as everything seemed routine, had she begun to feel as though this was not just another case, but something far more personal? The courtroom seemed to fade into the background as Rebecca Williams's thoughts spiraled into chaos. She could barely focus on the lawyer's continuing argument about Elijah's supposed issues. The words felt hollow, like a dull echo in her ears, drowned by the rhythmic pulse of her heart. Patricia Turner's voice was sharp, detailing every flaw Elijah had, every reason they decided to give him up, his refusal to engage, his outbursts, his silence, as if he were a malfunctioning piece of machinery, to be returned to the system for repair. But Rebecca's mind wasn't on the Turners' testimony anymore. Her gaze remained fixed on Elijah, still small and silent in the front row. The light from the high courtroom windows cast long shadows, and the soft glow revealed the stark contrast between the haughty, polished demeanor of the Turners and the fragile, broken image of the child they were about to abandon. Elijah's eyes remained fixed on the floor, his hands still clutching the photograph like a lifeline. It was then, amidst the tension, that something unexpected happened. Elijah lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes finally meeting Rebecca's with a strange, unwavering intensity. The moment their gazes locked, time seemed to slow, and Rebecca felt the earth beneath her shift, as though everything she had built her life on was suddenly trembling. His eyes, wide and knowing, drilled into hers with such familiarity that it struck her like a thunderbolt. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just any child. The connection between them was undeniable. It wasn't just the weight of his stare or the haunting quality of his expression, it was something deeper. Something she couldn't explain, yet knew instinctively. His eyes seemed to speak a silent language, one only they could understand. "You're my mom." The thought flitted through her mind with such sudden force that she almost gasped. But there was no time for that. This was a courtroom, not a dreamscape, and she had to maintain control. Still, as she glanced down at the file before her, everything felt increasingly disconnected. The sterile records, the foster home notes, the medical jargon, all of it seemed trivial compared to the powerful, silent plea in Elijah's gaze. Rebecca had heard the legalities, the arguments, the cold reasoning behind every decision made in family court. But none of it had ever felt this personal before. A child, discarded and misunderstood, looking at her as though she were the missing piece of his broken world. What was this? What had she just experienced? It was as if Elijah's eyes, his very presence, were forcing her to confront a truth she had buried for years. The room seemed to hold its breath as she locked eyes with the boy who might just hold the key to unlocking the dark puzzle that had haunted her for so long. The photo he clutched fell onto the floor, unnoticed by Elijah as he stood suddenly, his body tense but determined. He spoke, his voice small, barely a whisper, yet it carried across the room with an undeniable clarity. "You're my mom." The words landed with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. For the briefest moment, Rebecca's mind reeled, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of it all. She could barely breathe as the room erupted into murmurs. What was this child saying? Had he lost his mind, as the Turners suggested? Or was it possible, just possible, that Elijah had seen something she hadn't? The silence in the room was deafening, and Rebecca's heart raced as she rose from her chair, her legs trembling beneath her. She couldn't process it, not yet. The room's cold professional gaze, the murmurs, the Turners' shocked faces, they all blurred into insignificance. All she could focus on was Elijah's words, the certainty in his voice, the connection that surged between them like electricity. His words were a spark, igniting something long buried inside her, something that refused to stay hidden any longer. "You're my mom." The words repeated in her mind like a mantra. Could it be true? Was this child really the son she had lost so many years ago? The child she had thought was gone forever? And if it was true, what was she supposed to do with this revelation? The room hummed with tension as Rebecca Williams stood frozen in place, her pulse thudding in her ears, trying to grasp the magnitude of what Elijah had just said. The murmurs of the courtroom swirled around her, but they felt distant, muffled by the overwhelming rush of emotion that gripped her chest. "You're my mom." The words reverberated through her mind, replaying over and over as her world tilted on its axis. The weight of them was unbearable. The gravity of a truth she had buried deep inside her for years suddenly crashing to the surface. She couldn't breathe. She had never allowed herself to hope, never, but here was this child, standing in front of her, with eyes that reflected a connection she couldn't deny. Her heart lurched as the full impact of Elijah's words settled deep in her bones. She could hardly focus on the noise of the courtroom, the Turners' protests, their shrill objections, as their world crumbled in the face of what Elijah had just revealed. The quiet, small boy with the haunted eyes had shattered everything she thought she knew. He wasn't just another victim of the system, a broken child who had been passed from one foster home to another. He was the child she had lost, the child who had been stolen from her. And he had found her, against all odds, against all the walls of fear and doubt she had carefully constructed over the years. As Elijah's words hung in the air, Rebecca's mind flashed back to a time she had long tried to forget. A hospital room, a loss so raw, so deep, she had never let herself speak of it. A baby, a son, taken from her before she could even hold him. A certificate of death, signed and sealed. A family ripped apart without a chance to say goodbye. The pain of that moment had shaped her entire life, had driven her to fight for the justice of other children, had made her the judge she was today. But Elijah's eyes, the way he looked at her, as if he knew her in ways no stranger ever could, tore down the walls of her carefully constructed detachment. Could this be real? She fought to regain control, to steady her breath, to focus on the present. Elijah, standing before her, waiting for her to respond, his small hands clutching the photograph that had somehow become the symbol of this impossible, unexpected connection. She didn't know how to speak. Words felt useless, powerless against the storm of emotion churning inside her. She had no idea how to process this. How could she? But Elijah stood there, unwavering, his eyes still locked on hers. He was waiting for her, as if he knew she would understand, as if he knew, in the depths of his small soul, that their bond was real. Finally, with a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke, her words trembling in the weight of the moment. Elijah, where did you get that picture? The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, every eye on the boy who had spoken words that no one could easily dismiss. Elijah didn't hesitate. He simply lowered his head, his hand reaching into his pocket, and pulled out the photograph. As he handed it to her, Rebecca's heart nearly stopped. It was a photo of her, taken in a hospital garden, pregnant, glowing with anticipation. Her hand rested gently on her belly, as though protecting the child she was about to bring into the world. Her child. Her hand shook as she held the photograph, the past and the present colliding with such force it almost knocked her to her knees. She had thought she would never see her son again, that the loss was final, that nothing could ever undo what had been done to her. But here, in her hands, was the proof of something she could barely dare to hope for. This was her son. Elijah was her son. The photograph, the connection, the way he had recognized her, it all came rushing back to her in that single moment. Elijah had carried this picture with him all this time. He had kept it safe, knowing it was the key to finding her. And now, standing in this courtroom, they had found each other again. Her eyes filled with tears. And for a brief moment, Rebecca couldn't hold back the flood. This wasn't just a case anymore, this was her case. This was her son, the child she had lost and never stopped searching for, standing before her, and for the first time in 8 years, she had found him again. Rebecca could hardly breathe as she stood in her chambers, holding the photograph that had just been handed to her by Elijah. The weight of the moment felt like a storm pressing down on her chest. A mixture of disbelief, hope, and an overwhelming ache she had never allowed herself to feel. The image in her hands was a stark reminder of everything she had lost. The child she had been told was gone. The son she had mourned for years. But here it was, the evidence, undeniable and profound. Elijah. The same child she had grieved for. The child she had thought was taken from her forever. She could hear the distant murmurs of the courtroom beyond the closed door. But in that moment, nothing mattered but the child standing before her, looking up at her with those familiar, haunting eyes. "You're my mom now," Elijah had said. Words that shattered the carefully constructed walls around her heart. Words that made the world feel impossibly small and impossibly big all at once. Her knees threatened to buckle under the weight of it. How could this be? How could she have missed the truth for so long? Her mind raced, spiraling with 1,000 questions. 1,000 memories she had buried deep. She had thought she had lost him. She had thought the story had ended in that hospital room, where everything had been taken from her in an instant. But Elijah was standing right here. And he was telling her that the loss wasn't final. That the bond between them hadn't been erased, even though it had been stolen away. For a moment, the room around her seemed to blur and fade as everything in her life came into sharp focus. The endless cases of lost children. The fight for justice. The years of burying her own grief behind her robes. None of it mattered now. The truth had risen from the ashes of that pain. And it was standing in front of her, looking up at her with an unmistakable recognition in his eyes. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears. The rush of blood drowning out the sound of the murmurs outside. Drowning out everything except for the boy before her. Slowly, trembling, she bent down and placed the photograph on her desk, her fingers tracing the edges as if she could somehow hold onto the past and the future at the same time. Could this really be real? She wasn't sure. It seemed impossible. But the pull in her chest, the way she recognized the quiet strength in Elijah's gaze, told her that this was no coincidence. He was her son. He had to be. The very same son who had been taken from her. The very same son who had been stolen from her life. Was standing before her, claiming her as his mother. It was as if everything that had been wrong in the world was being righted in this single, heart-wrenching moment. She wiped away the tears that had begun to fall, pressing her lips together to steady herself. Elijah was watching her intently, waiting for her to respond, waiting for some sign that she understood. And then, she knew. She had no words, no answer that could adequately express what she was feeling. But she reached out, her arms shaking, and pulled him into a tight embrace. The tears flowed freely now, not just from the loss of all those years but from the raw, overwhelming truth that was finally being realized. He was here. He had found her. In that embrace, time seemed to stand still. The chaos of the courtroom, the accusations, the legal jargon, it all faded away, leaving only the profound connection between a mother and her child. For the first time in 8 years, Rebecca allowed herself to let go of the grief she had carried for so long. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a mother who had been reunited with her son. And in that moment, the world felt both impossibly broken and whole again. Rebecca's mind raced as she walked back into the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. Elijah's words, "You're my mom now," echoed in her mind like a haunting melody. Impossible to shake. She tried to steady herself, to grasp onto the professional distance she had spent years cultivating. But today, nothing seemed to make sense. The courtroom was still buzzing with whispers when she stepped back behind her bench, her hands gripping the edge of the podium. Every fiber of her being was consumed with the sudden, overwhelming truth. The child she had been told was dead. The child she had mourned for years was alive. The Turners were still sitting before her, their eyes avoiding hers, the tension thick in the room. They had petitioned for Elijah's release, claiming that he was too difficult to manage, too traumatized to fit into their home. Their words felt like daggers to her heart, each syllable a sharp reminder of the system that had failed Elijah. The same system that had failed her. "We've done everything we could," Patricia Turner's voice had said, dripping with disdain. "Elijah is simply too much to handle. He refuses to speak, refuses to connect." Rebecca's jaw tightened at the coldness in her words. How could they not see the truth? How could they not understand that Elijah's silence was a scream for help? A desperate plea to be seen, to be heard? His refusal to bond wasn't defiance, it was survival. She looked at Elijah, sitting silently in the front row, his hands still clutching the photograph, his knuckles white with the tension. He was so small, so fragile, but there was strength in his stillness. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them. There was no doubt in her mind now. Elijah was her son. The boy before her wasn't just another victim of the foster care system. He was her child, and he was calling out to her in a way she couldn't ignore. Rebecca stood tall, her eyes unwavering as she addressed the court, her voice steady but filled with a depth of emotion she could no longer suppress. "I would like to speak to Elijah in private," she said, her tone firm, commanding. No one in the room could deny her authority. But this time, it wasn't the authority of a judge, it was the desperate need of a mother. The murmurs began again as Elijah stood, his small frame barely noticeable among the adults. But his presence was magnetic. Every eye followed him as he made his way toward the chambers, his hands still clutching that worn photograph like a lifeline. Rebecca's heart clenched as she watched him, feeling the weight of the moment press against her chest. How many times had she wondered what it would be like to hold him again? To look into his eyes and know, without question, that he was hers? Inside her chambers, the door clicked shut behind them, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Elijah stood before her, silent and still, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. She knelt down to his level, her voice soft but filled with a certainty she could no longer deny. "Elijah," she whispered, "you're safe now. I'm your mom. And I'll never let you go again." Elijah didn't respond at first. But then, as if the weight of his silence had lifted, he stepped forward. With a quiet sob, he let go of the photograph and fell into her arms. She held him close, her own tears streaming down her face. As the truth finally settled in her bones, this was her son. She had found him again. In that moment, everything changed. The courtroom, the legal battles, the injustices, they no longer mattered. What mattered was the boy in her arms. The boy who had found his way home. and the promise she had made to him, that she would never let him go again. Rebecca paced her chambers, the weight of the photograph still heavy in her hand. The words Elijah had spoken in the courtroom replayed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. "You're my mom now." The simple yet powerful declaration had shaken her to her core, leaving her breathless and disoriented. For 8 long years, she had buried her grief, had convinced herself that her son was gone forever. And yet, here he was, standing before her, claiming her as his mother with a certainty that matched her own. She could hardly comprehend it, but at the same time, everything about him, the way he looked at her, the way his hands gripped the photograph like it was a lifeline, told her that it was true. She stopped pacing and looked at the photograph again, her heart sinking as she examined the faded edges, the soft creases from being held so tightly over the years. The photo was a snapshot of her younger self, her face glowing with anticipation as she sat in a hospital garden, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. It was the last image taken before everything went wrong, the very day her world had been shattered, the day they had told her her son was stillborn, the day they had stolen him from her. Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. How could this be happening? How could Elijah, the child she had lost, be standing before her, so sure that she was his mother? How had she missed it all these years? The court case, the foster homes, the years of brokenness, it all seemed like a cruel, twisted game. But now, here in this moment, Elijah was more than a case. He was her son, and she wasn't going to lose him again. The sound of footsteps brought her back to the present. Sarah Martinez, the social worker, entered the room slowly, her face a mixture of concern and understanding. "Judge Williams, are you all right?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of both professional respect and personal care. Rebecca nodded, though her hands still shook as she placed the photograph on her desk. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she knew she wasn't. Her mind was spinning with everything she had just learned, the corruption, the conspiracy, and most devastating of all, the realization that her son had been taken from her, sold to strangers, placed in foster homes, and discarded like some kind of commodity. The thought twisted her stomach into knots. But the most painful part was the truth that had been right in front of her the whole time. Elijah had always been her son. He had been right there, slipping through the cracks of the system, yearning for her, just as she had yearned for him. They had been searching for each other in the most painful way imaginable. How could she have not seen it? "Elijah, he's my son," Rebecca murmured to Sarah, the words tasting strange on her tongue, but also right. Sarah didn't respond immediately, just quietly took a seat across from Rebecca, letting her words hang in the air. She could see it in the judge's eyes. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was her life, her heart, and she was no longer the distant, professional judge. She was a mother, and all that mattered now was finding out the truth, the whole truth, about what had happened to her son. Rebecca's hand tightened around the photograph once again, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in something that she had thought was long gone: hope. "We need to find out everything about New Beginnings Family Services," Rebecca said, her voice stronger now, filled with a sense of purpose. "This isn't just about Elijah anymore. This is about every child they've taken, every family they've torn apart. It's time for this to end." As the words left her mouth, a sense of resolve settled over her. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a mother, and she would stop at nothing to bring the truth to light, to make sure Elijah, and every other child, got the justice they deserved. She looked up at Sarah, her eyes determined. "Get me everything you can. We'll start with New Beginnings. But this goes deeper. We need to bring down the whole network." "And we will." Sarah nodded, her face reflecting the gravity of the task ahead. They weren't just fighting for Elijah anymore. They were fighting for every child who had been stolen, for every mother who had been told her baby was dead. The fight for justice had begun, and they weren't going to stop until every last secret was exposed. The morning air felt different as Rebecca stared out of her office window. The city below bustling in its usual routine. But she knew, deep down, that nothing in her world would ever be the same again. Everything had changed since Elijah's words shattered the silence in the courtroom. His simple declaration still ringing in her ears. "You're my mom now." The revelation had stunned her into disbelief. But as the minutes ticked by, the weight of his gaze and the certainty in his voice made her heart swell. It wasn't just a moment of connection, it was a reckoning. Behind her desk, Rebecca sifted through the papers. The files that had once seemed like mundane cases now felt distant and irrelevant. The corruption she had always believed to be something intangible, something distant from her own life, was now at her doorstep. This case, her case, was the key to exposing everything. Her mind raced through the implications. The deep-seated web of deceit that stretched from the hospital to the highest echelons of power. A conspiracy to steal children, to sell them to the highest bidder, to make parents believe their babies were dead, and Elijah had been one of them. The truth she had buried so long ago, the unbearable loss of her son. The death certificate that haunted her like a ghost, was now in question. And Elijah, this quiet, withdrawn child with eyes that had once mirrored her own, had been right there, waiting to be found, waiting to be seen. The photograph he clutched in his hands was a symbol of everything lost and found. A story of a mother's grief and a son's strength, both bound together by fate and love. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft knock at her door, and she looked up to see Sarah Martinez standing in the doorway. Her face a mix of concern and admiration. "Rebecca, I think we need to talk about what happens next." Sarah's voice was calm, but Rebecca could sense the tremor beneath it. The recognition that the storm was only just beginning. Rebecca stood, her hand instinctively reaching for the stack of documents on her desk. She was still processing the magnitude of Elijah's claim, still trying to reconcile the image of the child in front of her with the memories she had locked away. The photo on her desk, of her, pregnant, full of hope and dreams, was the last picture taken before her world fell apart. But now, with Elijah standing in her life, with his innocent but resolute gaze, everything was starting to make sense. He had always been hers, and she had always been his. "It's time," Rebecca said, her voice steady, though every word felt like it was ripping through her. "We're going after new beginnings. We're going after everyone who was involved in this. It's bigger than just Elijah now. This is about every stolen child. Every mother who believed she had buried her child." Her gaze met Sarah's, and in that moment, they both knew there was no turning back. The fight had just begun. Sarah nodded, a fierce determination in her eyes. "I'll get on it right away. We need everything we can get, every lead, every name, every document." She paused before adding, "But Rebecca, you're not just a judge anymore, are you?" Rebecca felt a sharp breath catch in her chest, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. No, she wasn't just a judge anymore. She was something far more powerful, a mother reclaiming her child. A woman who would stop at nothing to uncover the truth, to dismantle the system that had stolen her son and countless others. She wasn't just fighting for Elijah now, she was fighting for every mother who had been made to believe her child was gone. And for every child who had been erased from their families' lives. "Get me everything on New Beginnings," Rebecca said, her voice low but full of purpose. "And find the people who were involved. This ends now." Rebecca's heart raced as she stood in the quiet of her chambers, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk as though she could steady herself from the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. The photograph that had once been just a memory, a painful reminder of what she had lost, now felt like a beacon, a truth waiting to be uncovered. Elijah's words echoed in her ears, still ringing with the certainty of his belief. "You're my mom now." Her pulse quickened. How is this possible? How had she, a mother grieving a child she thought lost forever, now found him again in the eyes of this small boy, sitting before her with a photo that had already started to change everything? The moment Elijah had spoken, her world had shifted. The truth she had buried for years, her son, taken from her under false pretenses, was no longer just a part of her history. It was the key to something much larger, something dark and insidious. As she thought of the years of legal battles, the endless tears, the grief she had tried to bury under the weight of her job and her carefully constructed public persona, Rebecca realized just how deep the corruption went. She could still see Elijah's face when he had spoken those words. His eyes had locked with hers, and in that fleeting moment, she had known, he knew me. But the truth had not been fully revealed. The photo, now discarded on the floor, was only the beginning. There were still pieces of the puzzle to uncover, hidden beneath layers of deceit that spanned years, possibly decades. How could she have not seen it before? How could she have not realized, with her keen legal mind, that something was wrong when she had looked at Elijah and felt that sudden pull? That inexplicable connection? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft tap on her door. Sarah Martinez entered, her face marked with the strain of too many cases. Too much responsibility. But today, there was something different in her eyes. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "I've been going over Elijah's records again. Something is off. You need to see this." Rebecca followed Sarah to her desk. The file now opened in front of them. And as she scanned the pages, her breath caught. Elijah's past placements, marked with the familiar signs of neglect and rejection, took on a new, chilling significance. These weren't just failures of the foster system. These were meticulously planned disruptions, designed to break him down, to ensure he would never remember the life that had been stolen from him. But what really made her stomach churn was the name that kept popping up: New Beginnings Family Services. It had been the agency behind Elijah's placement for most of his life. But now, it was tied to something far darker. It was connected to an adoption ring, to trafficking, to a conspiracy so vast and insidious that it had somehow operated under the radar for years. Her mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding, but one thing was clear: Elijah had been part of a much bigger story. This wasn't just a fight to find her son. It was a fight to expose an entire network of corruption that had touched countless lives. "Sarah," Rebecca's voice was firm, but filled with a quiet fury. "Get me everything on this agency. I need every connection, every name. This is bigger than we thought." "Much bigger." Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. She had seen the cracks before, but now they were breaking wide open. "Rebecca, we need to act fast," Sarah added, her voice tense. "Once the media gets hold of this, there will be no turning back." Rebecca stood, her gaze unwavering as she looked out the window. The city bustling below her. But her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts already racing ahead to the battle they were about to face. The fight for Elijah was not over. Not by a long shot. What they had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind every stolen child, behind every forged document, there was a mother like her, someone who had been robbed of the most precious thing in the world. Rebecca's jaw tightened with resolve. This wasn't just about justice for Elijah anymore. This was about justice for every mother who had been deceived, for every child who had been taken. She would not stop until the truth was brought to light, no matter what it cost. With a steadying breath, she turned to Sarah. "We're going to expose this. We're going to bring them down. And we're going to make sure Elijah and every other child gets the justice they deserve." Sarah's face hardened with determination, knowing that this fight would take everything they had. But she also knew that with Rebecca leading the charge, they would stop at nothing to tear down the wall of corruption that had caused so much pain. Together, they would bring the truth to the surface. And nothing, no one, would stand in their way. As the first rays of dawn stretched across the sky, Rebecca found herself standing before her mirror, her hands trembling as she adjusted the collar of her blazer. It was a moment that should have felt triumphant, a culmination of years of pain, confusion, and now, hope. But it felt like the calm before the storm. The previous night, as she had held Elijah close, humming their lullaby to soothe him to sleep, she had promised herself that no matter the challenges ahead, she would protect her son and uncover the truth. But today, the weight of what they were about to face pressed heavily upon her shoulders. The room behind her was filled with activity. Sarah Martinez was busy preparing the files for their next meeting with the FBI, while Marcus Chen sat by the laptop, his face tense with concentration as he pieced together the latest developments. The investigation had grown exponentially in the past few weeks, expanding into multiple states, uncovering more and more victims as each layer of corruption was peeled back. Each new arrest, each new witness, felt like another step toward justice. But with every revelation, the risks grew greater. Powerful people, too many to count, were involved, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "Rebecca, you're ready," Marcus said, his voice calm but with a flicker of concern in his eyes. He knew this would be a long and dangerous fight, but he also knew the stakes had never been higher. The room fell silent as he turned toward her, his expression steely. "But it's not just about you and Elijah anymore. Everything, will change the course of history. It's bigger than we ever imagined." Rebecca nodded, taking a deep breath as she gazed at the photograph of Elijah that still rested on her desk. The same photograph he had been holding when he had declared, with such certainty, that she was his mother. The one that had shattered her world and set in motion a series of events that would expose the very heart of a criminal empire built on lies and greed. She could still hear his voice. Small but full of conviction. "You're my mom now." It was a sentence that had transformed her from a grieving mother into the fearless protector of her son, and countless other children whose stories were still waiting to be told. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, snapping her out of her reverie. It was a text from Sarah. "We've identified more children. More families. The FBI is tracking down leads faster than we thought." The words sent a chill down her spine. But it wasn't fear that surged through her veins, it was a fire. A determination that had only grown stronger since Elijah had walked into her courtroom. His face like a mirror reflecting everything she had once lost. In the kitchen, Elijah sat at the table, carefully spreading peanut butter on a slice of bread. His small hands steady despite the tremor of excitement that buzzed through him. He had come so far from the withdrawn, silent boy who had first entered her life. Now, he laughed, joked, and even helped Sarah pack their things for their next step in this journey of truth. His presence was a constant reminder of everything they had fought for. And everything they would continue to fight for. Rebecca turned back to Marcus, her mind racing through the next steps. "We need to hit them hard. We need to expose everyone, every last one of them," she said, her voice low and unwavering. "We'll gather the families, the witnesses, the evidence. This stops now." Marcus met her gaze, the unspoken understanding passing between them. They weren't just dismantling a trafficking ring, they were starting a movement. One that would echo through the halls of power and strip away the veneer of the system that had long protected the guilty. This was about more than bringing criminals to justice. It was about restoring what had been stolen from so many families. Sarah walked in, her eyes tired but sharp, holding up more files. "We've got the final pieces of the puzzle," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "The Turners are crumbling. We've got everything we need to expose them for who they really are." Rebecca nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. She knew the next few days would bring more revelations, more arrests, more heart-wrenching truths, but she also knew that each step forward brought them closer to justice. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca turned to Elijah, who had finished his breakfast and was now carefully placing his favorite toy lion in his backpack. He looked up at her with those wise eyes, eyes that had once been clouded with confusion and fear, but now shone with clarity and hope. "Mom?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are we really going to help all the kids?" Rebecca knelt down, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied softly. "We're going to make sure they all find their way home, just like you found yours." And with that, the small family walked out of the door, ready to face the storm together. The battle was far from over, but now they had the truth on their side, and no one, no matter how powerful, could silence it. As they drove to meet the FBI task force, Rebecca couldn't help but feel the weight of the day's importance. This wasn't just a fight for Elijah, it was a fight for every child. Every family torn apart by the lies of a system that had failed them. And they were going to make sure it would never happen again. The air in the room was thick with anticipation as Rebecca sat at the desk, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she held the final DNA test results in her hands. The envelope seemed to burn against her palm, a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she had lost, and everything that was finally within her reach. As she tore open the seal, her heart pounded in her chest. She already knew what the test would say. Her heart had known the truth long before science had confirmed it. But still, she couldn't help the wave of emotion that flooded her as she read the final conclusion. 99.9% probability of maternal relationship. It was real. It was real. She whispered the words to herself, her breath catching in her throat as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. It was real. Her son, the child she had been told had died so many years ago, was alive. He was standing in the kitchen, making a sandwich, laughing, and playing. He was real. He was here. The moment she had dreamed of for so long was finally here. But it didn't feel like a fairy tale. It felt like the beginning of a long and challenging road. She glanced at Elijah, his face bright with the innocence of childhood. But his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, spoke of everything he had endured, everything he had survived. His simple presence was proof of their strength, both his and hers. He was her miracle. And now, They would fight to make sure no other child would be lost the way he had been. "Mom," Elijah said, breaking her from her thoughts. "What's the next step?" Rebecca smiled softly, brushing away the tears that had escaped her eyes. "The next step, my love, is making sure that what happened to you, what happened to us, never happens again. We're going to make sure no other child is stolen from their mother." As she spoke those words, a sense of certainty washed over her. This was no longer just a fight for her son. It was a fight for every mother who had been told their child was dead. For every child who had been taken from their family. For every broken heart that had been left behind by a corrupt system. Marcus Chen, who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, stood by the door, a look of determination in his eyes. "The investigation is growing," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "More families are coming forward. More children are being identified. The FBI task force is expanding faster than we thought. The evidence is stacking up. And the criminals, the ones who've been profiting from this for decades, they're starting to crumble." Rebecca nodded, her mind racing with all the things they still had to do. There were more arrests to make, more victims to find, more pieces of the puzzle to uncover. But for the first time, she felt hopeful. This fight was far from over. But they were no longer fighting alone. They had the truth on their side. And they had each other. Later that afternoon, as the FBI continued their work, Rebecca found herself sitting in her study, looking through the photographs of Elijah's early years, photographs that had once been impossible to believe were real. She ran her fingers over the photo of Elijah as a baby. A healthy, happy child who had been stolen from her and placed in a system that had failed him time and time again. And yet, despite everything, here he was, her son, alive, with her. The door to the study creaked open, and Elijah walked in, holding his favorite stuffed lion. "Are we going to help the other kids now?" he asked. His voice quiet but steady. Rebecca smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to help them all. We're going to make sure every child who was taken has the chance to be with their real family." Elijah smiled back, his face lighting up with the hope of a future he had never dared to imagine. "Like Miss Jenny helped us?" "Exactly like that," Rebecca replied softly. "And just like you're helping now. By telling the truth, by remembering, you're giving other children the courage to do the same. You're their hero." The days ahead would be filled with challenges. There were more families to reunite, more perpetrators to bring to justice, and more battles to fight. But for tonight, Rebecca allowed herself to be present in this moment, holding her son close, watching him drift off to sleep in her arms. The journey ahead was long, but she was no longer alone. Together, they had found each other again, and nothing, no matter how powerful or corrupt, could ever tear them apart. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the quiet lake outside Rebecca's new home. The evening air was cool but comforting, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the trees that surrounded their house. Inside, the house hummed with the soft sounds of daily life, Elijah's laughter as he played with Sophie in the yard. Sarah Martinez's voice as she spoke with the FBI agents about the latest updates. It had been a whirlwind since that day in the courtroom, a year that had felt like both a lifetime and a mere blink in time. Rebecca leaned against the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, watching her son from the window. Elijah had changed so much in the past year. The quiet, withdrawn boy who had once barely spoken now played freely, his laughter filling the space around him like music. He was helping Sophie, teaching her how to skip rocks across the lake, showing her how to breathe through the anxiety that had once overwhelmed him. The transformation in him was nothing short of miraculous. The FBI had made incredible progress, and the truth they had fought so hard to uncover was finally coming to light. More arrests had been made, more families had been reunited, and the child trafficking ring that had terrorized so many lives was crumbling under the weight of its own lies. It had been a battle that felt impossible at times. But Rebecca had always known, there was nothing stronger than the bond between a mother and her child. And no force on earth could break it. As Rebecca stood there, watching her son, the realization of everything they had accomplished washed over her. She had fought for him. For every child who had been stolen. For every mother who had been told their baby was dead. And now, because of their courage, their refusal to accept the lies, families were being reunited. Children were being saved. The world was changing, one truth at a time. A soft knock at the door brought her back to the present. It was Marcus, carrying the latest case files. "We've identified 15 more children in the system," he said, his voice grim, "and there are more to come. The scope of this operation, it's bigger than we thought." Rebecca took the files from him, her eyes scanning the names and details. Each new discovery was a bittersweet victory, another child found. Another mother given the truth she thought she had lost. But even with all the progress, there was still so much more to be done. The work was never over. Not as long as there were children still waiting to be found. Still families torn apart by a system that was supposed to protect them. "How's Elijah?" Marcus asked, his voice softer now, as he glanced toward the window where the children played. Rebecca smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "He's better than I could have ever imagined. He's healing, growing, but more than that, he's helping others. He's becoming the hero I always knew he was." Marcus nodded, watching the children play. "He's more than a hero. He's the heart of this whole movement. His courage, it's inspiring." As Rebecca looked at Elijah, laughing and teaching Sophie, her heart ached with gratitude. He had given so much more than she could ever have imagined. He had given hope. To her, to the other families, to the children who had been told their lives didn't matter. The truth had a way of coming out, no matter how hard people tried to bury it. And with it, came the healing. Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the peacefulness of the evening. They had survived the darkest times. Now, it was time to rebuild. To help others rebuild. As the night deepened, Rebecca stood with Marcus and Sarah, planning the next steps in the investigation. The FBI was moving fast. The pressure mounting as more names were uncovered. More criminals exposed. The work was grueling, but they had momentum, and nothing could stop them now. Elijah's laughter echoed in the yard, pulling Rebecca's attention back to him. He was her anchor, her source of strength. She had fought for him. And now, they were fighting for every other child still lost. Still waiting for the truth to set them free. It would be a long journey, but they would face it together. With a final glance at the lake, Rebecca made her way outside to join her son. The world had been broken by greed, by corruption, but love, truth, and the courage of one little boy had the power to heal it. And that, she knew, was just the beginning. The conference hall was filled with the hum of conversation, the air thick with anticipation and a sense of urgency. Today, Rebecca Williams stood at the podium, the weight of everything she had been through and fought for now visible in the thousands of eyes fixed upon her. Behind her, a screen flickered with images of families reunited, children smiling with their parents after years of painful separation. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for, the truth finally coming to light. The criminals who had torn apart innocent lives now being held accountable. But it was more than just a moment of triumph for Rebecca. It was a moment of profound healing, a chance to honor every child, every mother, who had been forced to carry the unbearable burden of a loss they never deserved. As she spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion, she thought of Elijah, sitting front and center with Sophie, his closest friend, by his side. He had blossomed into someone who exuded quiet confidence, a 9-year-old boy who, against all odds, had transformed his trauma into a tool of change. His journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. The boy who had once been withdrawn, his voice silenced by fear, was now a beacon of hope, helping other children heal with every word he spoke, every gesture he made, and his smile. It was a smile that had become a symbol of the victory of love over everything that had tried to break him. Today we celebrate not just reunions, but justice, Rebecca continued, her words echoing through the hall. Over 300 perpetrators have been convicted. 42 corrupt officials are serving prison terms. 8 hospitals have been held accountable. But most importantly, 573 children have found their way back to their real families. Her heart swelled as she spoke the words, each one carrying the weight of years of pain, loss, and the hard-fought victories that had led them to this point. The room erupted in applause, the sound deafening, but Rebecca barely noticed. She was lost in the faces of the families before her, those who had, like her, been told their babies were dead, only to learn that their children had been stolen and sold. Today, they had their children back. Today, they had their answers. Elijah stood next to her now, his hand firmly grasped in hers. He spoke into the microphone, his voice clear and strong, filling the room with the same certainty that had driven them all forward. When I found my mom, I thought it was just our miracle. But then we learned about other kids like me. Other moms who lost their babies. Now we help them find each other too." His words, simple yet powerful, brought the entire room to its feet. The applause was thunderous, but it was not for Rebecca alone. It was for every child who had been taken, every family torn apart, every person who had had the courage to speak out, to stand against the system that had perpetuated the lies. It was a moment of reckoning, of redemption. As the ceremony continued, families exchanged stories, their voices filled with both sorrow and joy as they recounted their journeys, stories of pain, of resilience, of love lost and found. The children who had once been silent, withdrawn, and fearful now ran through the aisles, their laughter ringing through the air. Sophie and Elijah were among them, showing their new friends how to laugh, how to trust, how to be children again. They had taken the darkness they had endured and transformed it into light. A light that now illuminated the entire hall. Rebecca looked out over the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of the mothers, fathers, and children whose lives had been forever changed. They had all come together, united by one simple truth: love and justice would always win. No matter how deep the corruption or how powerful the enemy. She thought of all the cases still being processed, all the families yet to be reunited. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The work wasn't done, far from it, but this was a victory. And it was a victory that had come because of Elijah, the boy who had refused to forget, who had never stopped hoping, and whose courage had sparked a revolution. As the event drew to a close, Rebecca stood tall, her heart filled with gratitude for every step that had led her here. For every person who had walked beside her in this fight. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But now, she wasn't alone. With Elijah by her side, with the families they had helped, and the children they had saved, Rebecca knew they would face whatever came next. Together, the movement they had started was unstoppable. And it was only just beginning. And as she looked at Elijah, smiling beside her, she knew that the journey was worth every step. The sun was setting as Rebecca sat in her study, the weight of the past year finally settling in her bones. Elijah was outside, playing with Sophie, laughing in a way that still seemed too good to be true. After everything they had been through, to see him like this, to see him so happy, so free, was a miracle she never thought she'd witness. The journey from the courtroom, from that first shocking moment when Elijah had stood and said those 4 life-altering words, had led them here, to this peaceful home, this moment of quiet contentment. Yet, as Rebecca glanced at the stack of files on her desk, the truth was far from over. The battle was still raging, only now it was being fought in boardrooms, courtrooms, and task forces rather than the dark corners of the system where they had started. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence of the evening. She glanced at the message, her heart quickening as she read it. The DNA database was lighting up with more matches, more children being reunited with their families. But it wasn't just the matches that caught her attention, it was the names of the families involved. More victims, more stories waiting to be uncovered. The scope of the operation, the web of corruption, was larger than they had ever imagined. And yet, they were making progress, piece by piece, inch by inch. With a deep breath, Rebecca picked up her phone and dialed Marcus. The conversation was brief but vital. New leads had come in, and there were more arrests to be made. The FBI was tightening its grip on the criminal syndicate that had torn apart so many lives. But even as she felt a sense of victory, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The legal battles, the public outcry, the relentless scrutiny, they were all waiting. But nothing could extinguish the hope that had been sparked, the light that had begun to shine through the darkness. Rebecca stood and walked to the window, watching as Elijah and Sophie played, their laughter echoing in the distance. They were safe. For now, but the world outside, the world of corruption and greed, was still out there. Her role in this movement, in this fight for justice, was far from over. But looking at Elijah, at the way he had transformed from a broken boy into a beacon of hope, she knew they were on the right path. They had won battles, but the war was ongoing. And this time, they would fight it together, with love as their shield and truth as their sword. One step at a time, she whispered to herself. As the first stars began to twinkle in the evening sky. It had been a long, painful road, but Rebecca knew, together, they would rebuild what had been lost. They would bring more children home, reunite more families, and hold accountable the systems that had allowed such atrocities to thrive. The fight was far from over. But with Elijah by her side, she knew they would face whatever came next with the same courage. The same unwavering belief that justice could, and would, be served. As the night deepened, Rebecca smiled softly, her heart full, knowing they were no longer just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for every child. Every mother, every family that had been torn apart by greed. And they would not stop until the truth had been fully revealed and justice had been done.